Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're very pleased to have you with us today for a very Jewish Christmas, Jesus and Shabbtai Zvi, from Heretic to Hero, with the very esteemed Professor David Biale. For those that are new to YIVO, YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and for the contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library used by researchers around the world with more than 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. And in addition to making these materials accessible, we have a variety of public programs like this. We have classes, exhibitions, and a lot more. So if you're new to YIVO, please come back. And if you're a YIVO stalwart, then thank you so much for being part of our community. This particular talk is a part of a Jewish Christmas kind of series that we've been doing for some years now. Every December, there's the December dilemma for Jews who have lived in Christian societies for a very long time now. And Jews have reacted to it in all sorts of ways. And so we've done events about Jewish Christmas songs written by Jewish composers, Christmas traditions that Jews had in the old world and Yiddish-speaking communities. We've done events about Jews and Chinese food. We're very pleased to have Professor David Biale here with us today. So David Biale is Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor of Jewish History at the University of California, Davis. He was educated at UC Berkeley, the Hebrew University and UCLA. Professor Biale is a titan of the Jewish studies world, and I'll just name some of his books, which you may be familiar with. The New Hasidism, A New History, which was co-authored with a bunch of other scholars. Gershom Scholem, Master of the Kabbalah. Not in the Heavens, the Tradition of Jewish Secular Thought. Gershom Scholem, Kabbalah and Counter-History. Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History. Eros and the Jews. Blood and Belief, the Circulation of a Symbol Between Jews and Christians. And Professor Biale is also the editor of Cultures of the Jews, A New History, and of the Norton Anthology of World Religions, Judaism. So we're really pleased. Thank you so much, Professor Biale, for being with us. And without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually at YIVO. I spent a number of wonderful residencies at YIVO. In fact, in one of them, I worked on the book on Hasidism that Alex just mentioned. YIVO is truly one of the most exciting and dynamic Jewish institutions in the world. And so pleased that so many people from all around can join for this event. What I'm going to do today actually is I'm not going to talk about Jesus and Shabbtai Zvi as they were seen by traditional Jewish culture, but instead, how are they seen in modern Jewish culture? How did modern Jews think about these two figures who obviously in traditional Jewish culture were great villains? And what we're going to see is that both Jesus and Shabbtai Zvi were figures on whom you could project whatever you wanted. And so they turn out to be really, really fascinating to study just in terms of how traditional modern Jews have thought of them. So I'm going to start actually with a Hasidic text, even though that's sort of kind of a way to jump off from a traditional text into a more modern text. I'll share the screen now. Let's see here. Oops. Looks like. So we're going to start. Oops, sorry. See, I've got to minimize myself because otherwise I'm blocking the text. So we start with a text from Shivchei HaBesht, In Praise of the Baal Shem Tov, a text from about 1814, 1815 that gathered all kinds of legends about the Baal Shem Tov, the assumed founder of Hasidism. And this is a good way to start because it's a text where Shabbtai Zvi and Jesus appear together. So it goes like this. Rabbi Joel said that Shabbtai Zvi came to the Besht to ask for rectification or redemption, tikkun, hard term to exactly define. Rabbi Joel said tikkun is done through the connection of soul with soul, spirit with spirit, and breath with breath. The Besht began to establish the connection moderately. He was afraid, as Shabbtai Zvi was a terribly wicked man. Once the Besht was asleep and Shabbtai Zvi, may his name be blotted out, came and attempted to tempt him, God forbid. With a mighty thrust, the best hurled him to the bottom of hell. The best appeared down and saw that he landed on the same pallet or the same place with Jesus. Rabbi Joel said that the best said that Shabbtai Zvi has a spark of holiness in him, but that Satan caught him in a snare, God forbid. Okay, let me say a few things about this really interesting text. So Shabbtai Zvi and Jesus land on the same place. But the Besh says that even though Shabbtai Zvi was a wicked man, he still had a spark of holiness in him. Without that spark of holiness, the Besh could not perform tikkun, that is, to raise his soul up and reunite it with God. Now, if he is landing on the same place as Jesus, then we might assume that actually they have something in common. Perhaps Jesus has the same spark of holiness in him. And in fact, what is going on here, which is so interesting, we have to go back to Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century. The way in which the Besht is able to perform tikkun is because the Besht's own soul, his spark of holiness, is part of the soul family of Shabbtai Zvi. That is, that's how he can establish the connection of soul with soul, spirit with spirit, and breath with breath. What this suggests to us actually is that just as Shabbtai Zvi claimed to be the Messiah, so did Jesus. Perhaps the Besht himself, Baal Shem Tov himself, had something of the messianic in him, that he had perhaps a spark of the soul of the Messiah. And so this is an ambivalent text because both of these figures are negative. Shabbtai Zvi, may his name be blotted out, okay? Nevertheless, as a spark of holiness. And of course, in traditional Jewish culture, Jesus is also, whenever one says the name of Jesus, one says, Yimach Shmo V'Zichro, may his name and memory be blotted out. And in fact, the name Jesus, and now we're going to turn to Jesus, excuse me. The name Jesus in Hebrew, Yeshu, is thought to be an acronym or an abbreviation for Yimach Shmo V'Zichro. May his name be blotted, his name and memory be blotted out. Of course, by saying his name in that way, you're not really blotting out his name at all. You're actually preserving his name. And that's sort of the point I want to make, that both the name of Shabbtai Zvi and the name of Jesus never get blotted out, but instead get reinterpreted. Let's go now, first part of our talk, which is on Jesus in modern Jewish culture. We start here actually with someone who, was he a modern Jew or not? Jacob Emden, one of the great Orthodox authorities of Germany of the 18th century. But Emden is already pointing towards a modern way of thinking about Jesus. And you'll see that this connects with Shabbtai Zvi as well. It is recognized that also the Nazarene, that is Jesus, and his disciples, especially Paul, warned concerning the Torah of the Israelites, to which all the circumcised are tied. And if they are truly Christians, they will observe their faith with truth and not allow within their boundary this new unfit Messiah, Shabbtai Zvi, who came to destroy the earth. Okay, what is he saying here? He's saying that according, at least in his interpretation, according to both Jesus and Paul, the Jews are tied to the law. The Jews must obey the law. And the Christians observe their faith, which is a separate religion from Judaism. The problem is with Shabbtai Zvi, because what Shabbtai Zvi is doing, he comes from within Judaism and he violates the law. So for Emden, Shabbtai Zvi is a much greater danger than the Christians. The Christians are observing a faith which in his estimation is entirely legitimate. So this is a very, very interesting. Emden engaged in the 1750s in a vituperative campaign against the 18th century errors of Shabbtai Zvi, the sort of 18th century Sabbateans, who were mostly covert Sabbateans in Germany. He was engaged in a campaign against them, as well as against Jacob Frank and his movement. Frank was a follower of Shabbtai Zvi who developed his own particular sect. Emden was on a campaign against both of these. For him, these late manifestations of Shabbtai Zvi were exceedingly dangerous, as opposed to Christianity, which in his view is perfectly legitimate. Let's now go to someone who was a contemporary of Jacob Emden's, Moses Mendelssohn, considered the founder of Jewish Enlightenment. And here, Mendelssohn and Emden, who actually were in correspondence with each other, knew of each other's work. Mendelssohn takes a fairly similar position to Emden. Even if one of us converts to the Christian religion, I fail to see how it is possible for him to believe that he thereby frees his conscience and rids himself of the law. In other words, a Jewish convert to Christianity remains a Jew and must continue to follow the law. Jesus of Nazareth was never heard to say that he had come to release the house of Jacob from the law. Indeed, he said in express words rather the opposite. And what is still more, he himself did the opposite. So this is an interpretation of Jesus. Of course, Jesus says famously in the book of Matthew that he has not come to overturn the law, but to fulfill it. And thinkers like Emden and Mendelssohn understand that to mean that Jews should continue to follow the law, even if they endorse Christianity, which is really quite an interesting position. Now we'll go to the 19th century, and we're going to take a look at a number of different thinkers, 19th and early 20th century. So Abraham Geiger, one of the founders of Reform in Germany, he sees Jesus as a precursor to Reform Judaism. He says he, that is Jesus, was a Jew, a Pharisaian Jew with Galilean coloring. He did by no means utter a new thought, nor did he break down the barriers of nationality. Okay, so Jesus remains a Jew, doesn't set out to found a new religion. This, by the way, is probably historically accurate, that Jesus did not set out to found a new religion. For Geiger, Jesus is nothing but a Pharisee. In other words, all those denunciations of the Pharisees that we see in the Gospels, they reflect later Christianity. They don't reflect what to Geiger is authentic Christianity, namely Pharisaian Judaism. This is what Jesus subscribed to, and that actually for Geiger, later Christianity, the Christianity of Paul and the later church, as well as the Judaism of the rabbis, depart from the teachings of the Pharisees. So Geiger makes a clear separation between Pharisees and later rabbis, something that the rabbis themselves don't do. But for Geiger, the Pharisees are the original Reformed Jews. And so what Geiger essentially is doing is saying original, authentic Christianity is actually Judaism, it's actually Reformed Judaism. Later Christianity is a kind of a heresy with respect to the movement that Jesus came to found. And so then in a certain sense, Geiger is engaged in a polemic against Christianity in embracing Jesus and, so to say, recapturing Jesus for Judaism. So let's go on. Let's go now to Martin Buber. So Martin Buber in the 20th century famously said, "From my youth onwards, I have found in Jesus my great brother. That Christianity has regarded and does regard him as God and Savior has always appeared to me a fact of the highest importance, which for his sake and my own, I must endeavor to understand. My own fraternally open relationship to him is growing ever stronger and clearer, and today I see him more strongly and clearly than ever before. I am more than ever certain that a great place belongs to him in Israel's history of faith, and that this place cannot be described by any of the usual categories." In other words, Buber is doing the same thing as Geiger. He is restoring Jesus to Judaism. And how does he do this? Well, this is in an essay called Two Types of Faith, where Buber distinguishes between emunah, biblical faith, which for him is a kind of immediate relationship with God, and a kind of doctrinal faith, which he associates with both Paul and the rabbis. So for Buber, Jesus really is a kind of a biblical Jew. And to go further, Jesus really is not a Jew who teaches the law. And that was exactly Buber's position. Buber was a religious anarchist who did not believe in the law. And so he embraces Jesus, puts him together with other biblical figures for whom the law is not essential, but rather the immediate faith in God, or the immediate kind of ecstatic unification that a mystic can have with God. And so Jesus, once again, is taken away from Christianity and restored to Judaism. A few other thinkers who I think are worth referring to here in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. Now, Joseph Klausner, who was a great scholar of Hebrew literature, also a political activist. He was a revisionist Zionist. In other words, he belonged to the right-wing sort of nationalist movement of Vladimir Jabotinsky. Klausner wrote a very important book on Jesus of Nazareth. And his argument boils down to something very interesting. Jesus, he said, was a messianist. That is, he believed in some kind of messianic movement, or he led some kind of messianic movement, which for Klausner was political, because for Klausner, messianism is a Jewish political doctrine. Why does he not embrace Jesus? After all, as a Zionist, maybe Jesus could have been a precursor. Not at all. The problem with Jesus for Klausner is that Jesus demanded such a extreme ethical position that he could never actually lead a true political movement. In other words, what one learns from studying Jesus is a kind of cautionary tale that a political nationalist movement cannot embrace a kind of absolute ethics. And so that's a very interesting way of setting up Jesus as someone who is too extreme to serve as a model figure. Sholem Asch, famous, very famous Yiddish writer, in the late 1930s, published a famous book, Der Mann von Nazaret, the Man from Nazareth, kind of biography of Jesus. And he couldn't publish it initially in Yiddish. He published it in 1939 in English, and then only 4 years later it came out. Huge controversy. People attacked him for a kind of restoration of Jesus to Jewish history, certainly at a time when, politically speaking, it was difficult to speak that way. He also wrote a trilogy, actually. The first book is on Jesus, then a book on Paul, another on Mary. And Asch was considered actually a kind of a heretic for trying to restore these figures to Jewish history. Another Yiddish writer, Laban Shapiro, this is early in the 20th century, writes a story called Der Tselem, the Cross. And this occasioned also an enormous controversy in the world of Yiddish letters, because what Laban Shapiro argues there is that in the pogroms, the pogromists actually engrave a cross on the foreheads of their victims, sort of like the mark of Cain. And when this cross is carved in their foreheads, it releases a kind of violence. And then the victims of the pogromists are allowed to express a kind of revenge upon their persecutors. So for Shapiro, the cross, the Tselem, is a symbol of violence, not of peace, not of redemption. And so this is also a very, very interesting interpretation I think, of Christianity now, not as a religion of peace, but as a religion of violence that, in terms of its impact on the Jews, releases a kind of violent revenge. Something, by the way, if we go back to the Middle Ages, to the Crusader pogroms in the 11th and 12th centuries, we find in the Hebrew chronicles of the pogroms a cry for vengeance against the Crusaders, and that cry for vengeance actually uses language borrowed from Christianity about blood vengeance, about the calling down, the blood of the victims will call down God to avenge his people. And so this idea of Christianity as a religion of violence, something we find actually in the Middle Ages, and Shapiro resurrects it, so to speak, in the 20th century. And finally, in my discussion here, we have Marc Chagall, who used images of Jesus. Now, really, he restored the image, or he took the image of the crucifixion. And here we have Jesus now with a kind of talit around him. And he is, and the images that surround Jesus on the cross are images from the pogroms, the burning of towns, the exile of the Jews. And so Jesus here is once again restored to his people. And the Jews are themselves now on the cross, which is an image that the great scholar of Yiddish literature, David Roskies, spoke about. Jews on the cross. Jews on the cross are the victims now of the pogroms. So this gives you an idea of the way in which modern Jewish thinkers and artists might take the image of the figure of Jesus and restore him to Jewish history, to make him once again a Jew and a representative of some of the travails of the Jews in modern times. Now we're going to turn to Shabbtai Zvi. Was he a failed Messiah or a modern hero? Of course, in the traditional Jewish response to Shabbtai Zvi, as we saw in the Emden text, very negative. Shabbtai Zvi is seen as a heretic within Judaism, trying to not so much found a different religion, but to overturn Judaism. He was seen as an antinomian, someone who is overturning the law, because if the Messiah has come, then perhaps the law no longer applies. We are in a new era, messianic era, when we no longer have to follow the law. And so, of course, Orthodox Jews rejected this, and Shabbtai Zvi was seen as a great heretic. But it's also very interesting, as with Jesus, to see how a number of modern Jewish writers embraced Shabbtai Zvi, saw him as a kind of, maybe not as positive really as Jesus, but in many ways a figure who might be identified with or reinterpreted as a kind of a modern Jew. And so the first person who I think is of great interest here is Theodor Herzl. Herzl, in his diaries, acknowledges what a number of people have said, is that maybe he was really a kind of a Shabbtai Zvi, a kind of a modern Shabbtai Zvi. And certainly his enemies may have seen him as such, trying to lead a messianic movement that could be heretical. And Herzl rejected this, and he said that Shabbtai Zvi was a kind of utopian, and Herzl was trying to lead a practical movement, although, of course, many people saw him as utopian. Now, in Herzl's utopian novel, Alt Neuland, Old New Land, a very, very interesting scene where his two heroes, his protagonists, they come through Palestine, they see it as a wasteland, and they go off to live on a desert island for 20 years. They come back, and the Zionists have now created a utopian community, and they go to Jerusalem, and their hosts take them there, and they ask them what they'd like to do in the evening. They offer them a number of different cultural options. One is a kind of Yiddish farce, and they reject that. That's too low for them. Another is an opera about Moses, and they think that, well, that's a little too highfalutin. And then they're offered an opera about Shabbtai Zvi. And who is Shabbtai Zvi? Well, Herzl writes in the text, Shabbtai Zvi was a false messiah who appeared in Turkey at the beginning of the 17th century. He's got the date wrong. It was actually 1665. He succeeded in gathering a great following among Oriental Jews, but later he became a Muslim and met a sorry end. I want to focus here on the great following among Oriental Jews, because what Herzl is saying is that this was a movement really of just the Jews of the Orient. Herzl was leading really a movement not of the Oriental Jews, not of the Mizrahim, but instead a European movement. This is the only place in Alp-Neuland where Herzl even refers to the Jews of the East. So it's very interesting. And this is actually a theme that I want to pursue in the next few minutes. Seeing Shabbtai Zvi as an Oriental Jew, and Jewish Orientalism, attraction to the East, is of course a very important theme in Zionism. In the early Zionist movement, there were many people, Herzl is not one of them, but there were many people who said we're going to return to the East because our origins are in the East. Martin Buber actually was one of those who argued that. So there is an attraction of the East, but there's also an ambivalence, a repulsion from the East, that it's the East is, and here it reflects a kind of European Orientalism, the East is a place of degeneracy, effeminacy. It's a feminine place. It's not a masculine place. It's irrational, et cetera, et cetera. All of these sort of stereotypes of the East that we know from various European non-Jewish writers, that view was adopted by some Jews as well. Herzl is certainly one of them. So a Zionist follower of Herzl, who wrote a very interesting biography of Shabbtai Zvi called Shabbtai Zvi, the Messiah of Izmir, Yosef Kashstein. He wrote this in about 1930. He was a follower of Zionism, and he ultimately in the 1930s emigrated to Palestine. This is a very interesting biography. It is a kind of historical fiction, but Kashstein did a lot of research, read a lot of sources. But what's so interesting is his way of explaining the movement. And he says Shabbtai Zvi succeeded, for the people he was addressing were not only credulous Jews, but also Orientals. In this connection, one should not forget that there were two factors which did much towards increasing credence for the reports that were circulated. In the Orient, the fickle receptivity towards fantasy, and in the West, the allure of the alien. Okay, so the Oriental Jews are irrational. They're attracted to a kind of a fantasy. In the case of the West, they're attracted to something which is alien, which is different, namely the Orient. The Jews in the West regarded Sabbatianism from a more worldly, concrete, and political point of view than the Oriental and Polish Jews. Here he lumps together the Jews of the East, of the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish Jews. They are both Eastern. They're not rational. They're not Western. And in their response, that is, of the Jews of the West, they showed passionate joy and unfettered exuberance rather than dark and painful penitential practices. So Kashstein makes a big distinction between the Jews of the West. He means really the German, the Central European and Western European Jews, Jews of Eastern Europe, and Jews of the Orient. Jews of the Orient are attracted to Shabbtai Zvi because of their irrationality. Jews of the West have a much more rational attraction. And in fact, I emphasize the word political here because this is one of the very interesting things in Kashstein's biography, that he notices that the Sabbatean movement wasn't only a religious movement, it was also a political movement. Shabbtai Zvi, in the propaganda that circulated about him at the time, was often represented as a king. He was going to restore Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And so the movement was a political movement, according to Kashstein, or at least according to some followers of the movement. And this, I think, is actually very insightful. And it's something that Gershom Scholem, the great historian of Sabbateanism, ignores. We'll get to Scholem in just a bit. So Kashstein, very, very interesting distinction between the Orient and the West. And he actually says that Shabbtai Zvi succeeds in attracting many, many followers. This is true. The Sabbatean movement was a worldwide movement. There were followers in Poland, in Germany, in Yemen, in Morocco, in the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. And Kashstein is trying to explain how it is that Shabbtai Zvi could attain this enormous following, even though in the end, of course, the movement fails when he is forced to convert to Islam. Now, another writer who has a very interesting take on Sabbateanism is Israel Zangwill, initially a supporter of the Zionist movement. Later, he breaks from it. He becomes so-called territorialist. And Zangwill, who wrote Dreamers of the Ghetto, very, very popular works, and in his treatment of Sabbateanism, he focuses on the erotic aspect of Sabbateanism. Why erotic? Because in a lot of the accounts of Shabbtai Zvi, which Zangwill elaborates on and fictionalizes, it's said that Shabbtai Zvi was married to two women and that he refused to consummate the marriage. He was an ascetic. He refused to consummate the marriage with these two women, and ultimately he married a woman named Sarah. We'll come to her in just a second, who was a survivor of the Chmelnytsky pogroms in Ukraine. And so Zangwill uses this as the occasion to write a kind of, let's call it softcore pornography. Obediently marrying the maiden provided by his father, the young ascetic, that is Shabbtai Zvi, passionately denied himself to the passion ripened precociously by the Eastern sun. The Eastern sun, again, we have the Orientalism here. And the marveling Beit Din released the virgin from her nominal husband. In other words, she was allowed to divorce him. Prayer and self-mortification were the pleasures of his youth. Notice this interesting passion, the passion of asceticism, the pleasure of self-mortification. The enchanting Jewesses of Smyrna, that is Izmir, picturesque in baggy trousers and open-necked vests, had no seduction for him, though no muslin veil hid their piquant countenances as with the Turkish women, though no prescription silenced their sweet voices and the psalmody of the table as among the sin-fearing congregations of the West. So here, actually, we see that the West is figured as actually very puritanical. So the East is actually quite passionate and sexual, but Shabbtai Zvi denies himself those pleasures until Sarah, this seductress from, according to some legends, from Ukraine. She comes and was clad in shimmering white Italian silk, which draped tightly about her bosom, showed her as some gleaming statue. Her eyes had strange depths of passion, perfumes breathed from her skin. Not thus came the maidens of Israel to wedlock, demure, spotless, spiritless, with shorn hair, priestesses of the ritual of the home. So you can see this kind of polemic Zangwill is aiming at Jewish brides. And she says, "'Tis through thee that I have forfeited the divine grace." She's speaking now directly to Shabbtai. "Thou hast made me unfaithful to my bride, the law." No, excuse me, Shabbtai is speaking here. He says that she has seduced him and he's no longer faithful. According to some legends, Shabbtai Zvi married the law, married the Torah under a chuppah, but now he is seduced by Sarah. Woman, thou hast polluted me. I have lost the divine spirit. It hath gone out from me. It will incarnate itself in another, in a nobler. Once I was a Messiah, now I am a man. Okay, so Shabbtai Zvi, in converting to Islam, has abandoned his messianic task because Sarah has seduced him. Now he becomes a man, which in a certain sense, we might say for Zangwill is a positive thing. Messianism is not the direction that the movement should have gone. Instead, you might say Zangwill is pointing towards enlightenment, towards secularism. Now I want to conclude this discussion of Sabbateanism in modern Jewish culture with a very bizarre writer some of you may have heard of, although he is by now somewhat forgotten, and that is Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. Now, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch came from Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is the area that is now in southern Poland and Ukraine. He was a famous or infamous writer of pornography, and it is from his name Masoch that we have the term masochism. So he wrote sadomasochistic pornography, but he also wrote, very interestingly, tales of the ghetto. He was fascinated by the Jews. He wasn't Jewish, of course. Fascinated by the Jews, got to know them quite well, understood their folklore. He read deeply in Jewish folklore. And these tales of the ghetto that he wrote are actually quite fascinating. I've written in a different place about the kind of convergence of his sort of erotic preoccupations or obsessions with his tales of the ghetto, where usually it's women, strong, kind of almost sadistic women who become his heroes in these tales. One of the things that he wrote was a biography of Shabbtai Zvi. And in this biography, we have the same kind of very interesting seduction of Shabbtai Zvi by Sarah, by his third wife, and in a scene which is actually, you know, pornographic. She flagellates him with a rose branch. She puts a crown of roses on his head, and she says, "I have made you a man, you saint, and this is the great miracle I have accomplished. Shabbtai Zvi, you are not the savior of Israel. You are not the Messiah." Same thing that has happened in the Zangwill account here with this kind of pornographic overlay. Of course, what's interesting is Shabbtai Zvi now with a crown of thorns, which is obviously Christian, a Christian symbol. But for Sacher-Masoch, who believed in a kind of enlightened secularism, he thought Christianity should also become a kind of secular philosophy. And so what he is doing here is really saying Shabbtai Zvi has become a kind of modern Jew. So it's a very, very interesting, bizarre text, I should say. So I want to conclude our discussion here by now turning to the great historian Gershom Scholem. And what did Scholem do with Sabbateanism? Now, of course, this would take us a whole lecture and more. But what's really interesting, I want to just point out a few features in Scholem's treatment of Shabbtai Zvi. Of course, Scholem thought that Shabbtai Zvi, the Sabbatean movement, was the great watershed in Jewish history that undermined rabbinic Judaism and paved the way towards modernity. And in this respect, he shares something with writers like Kastein or Zangwill, or even Sacher-Masoch. But he resolutely argued against any kind of feminine influence, not just in Sabbateanism, but in the history of Jewish mysticism. The long history of Jewish mysticism, he said, shows no trace of feminine influence. Kabbalah, therefore, lacks the element of feminine emotion, which has played so large a part in the development of non-Jewish mysticism. But it also remained comparatively free from the dangers entailed by the tendency towards hysterical extravagance which followed in the wake of this influence, a very misogynistic passage, I would say. Now, it's fascinating. We know from the sources on Sabbateanism that women played a very central role. It's not only in these writers from the 19th and 20th century that I've discussed here, where women are very central. We know that even at the time, women played very important roles as prophetesses. They would go into synagogues and prophesy the coming of Shabbtai Zvi. Women were very, very central to the movement. This is something that the great historian Ada Rappaport Albert wrote in a fairly recent book on women and the Sabbatean messianic movement. Scholem dismisses this. He gives it very little attention in his biography of Shabbtai Zvi, and that's because I think he wants to see Shabbtai Zvi from a kind of a Western point of view. At the same time, though, Scholem was very, very worried about these same hysterical extravagance that he understood fed the movement. So he wants to deny it, but he can't really totally deny it. And Scholem, who is, of course, a Zionist, moved to Palestine in 1923, participated in the founding of the Hebrew University. In his writings in the 1920s, it's very, very interesting. He polemicized against a interpretation of Zionism as messianic. He said the messianic phraseology of Zionism is not the least of those Sabbatean temptations which could bring to disaster the renewal of Judaism. As transient in time as all the theological constructions, including those of Cardozo, this is Abraham Cardozo, one of the propagandists for Shabbtai Zvi, and Jacob Frank, an 18th century follower of the Sabbatean movement. As transient in time as these theological constructions may be, the deepest and most destructive impulse of Sabbateism, the hubris of the Jews, remains. So Sabbateanism is very dangerous. It was essential, according to Scholem, to sweep away rabbinic Judaism and open the road to modern Judaism, but it was also very destructive. And if the Zionist movement embraces that kind of messianism, then it could become very destructive. And in a different place, he said, I absolutely deny that Zionism is a messianic movement, and it has the right to employ religious terminology for political goals. The redemption of the Jewish people, which as a Zionist I desire, is in no way identical with the religious redemption I hope for in the future. The Zionist ideal is one thing, and the messianic ideal another, and the two do not meet except in the pompous phraseology of mass rallies, which often infuse our youth with a spirit of new Sabbateanism, which must inevitably fail. The Zionist movement has nothing in common with Sabbateanism. Now, what does Scholem have in mind here in this text? This is in the 1920s. He is deliberately and in other places explicitly denouncing the revisionist movement of Jabotinsky, to which Joseph Klausner belonged. He saw them as a kind of new Sabbateans, or latter-day Sabbateans, who had embraced a messianic vision of Zionism, which he thought was extremely dangerous. I'm going to stop the share now and just conclude, actually, that I had the privilege of interviewing Scholem at the end of his life. This is in the year 1980. He died in 1982. And I asked him whether he still thought that there was a danger to Zionism from these same kind of latter-day messianic Sabbatean forces. At the time, I asked him explicitly about the settler movement, the Gush Emunim, which was quite new at that point, only 6 years old, but they were establishing settlements in the territories occupied in 1967. And Scholem explicitly said, yes, they are latter-day Sabbateans, and they will bring a great disaster to Zionism. And of course, we now have a new Israeli government that includes representatives of that movement. And so I leave it to you to decide whether we stand at a dangerous moment or not. Thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating talk, and there's a lot to keep talking about. I see one question here just about the historicity of Shabbtai Zvi, which maybe is a good thing to touch on before getting to other things. So one viewer asks, was Shabbtai Zvi an actual person? And what evidence do we have for his existence? And on the same token, for Jesus.
Right. So on Shabbtai Zvi, there's no doubt that he was a real person. We have very, very extensive sources, both Jewish sources in Hebrew. We have Christian sources about Shabbtai Zvi. We have Ottoman Turkish sources as well. So there's no question Shabbtai Zvi was a real person. And his movement was a real movement. It was, as Scholem argued, and I don't think anyone has been able to disprove this or even tried to disprove it, a worldwide movement. It's the first messianic movement in Jewish history that was truly worldwide. It wasn't just, a messianic figure in one country who attracted some followers, but because of the propaganda that went out from the Ottoman Empire, there were followers everywhere, people who sold their possessions preparing to go to the land of Israel when Shabbtai Zvi would take control of it as the Messianic king. With respect to Jesus, of course, more difficult to say. I think it very unlikely that Jesus didn't exist. I think he must have. But of course, the sources about Jesus are not contemporaneous sources. They are all later. The sources that are eventually become the Gospels are based on earlier sources, the so-called Q document, but even that document is probably from after the death of Jesus. My sense is that he's such a central figure, such an important. His name itself is magical in Christianity, that it's hard to believe that he didn't actually exist. Now, what did he actually teach? That's open to a lot of debate among scholars. And we don't know exactly. He probably did not teach that he was the Son of God. He probably did not teach that he was the Messiah. This is interpretations that came afterwards. Most likely he was a kind of magician who also was a kind of prophetic figure. Probably the social gospel may indeed reflect his actual teachings. That's as far as we can probably go.
Speaking of history, could you speak briefly? One viewer asks about how modern Jewish historiography has dealt with these figures like Gratz, Dubnov, Baron, and others, from more of a historical perspective.
Right. Well, Gratz, who had a very strong kind of ideology, driving him. He saw Shabbtai Zvi as a thoroughly negative figure, and what he does, he pairs Shabbtai Zvi with Spinoza, and it's indeed interesting that they're contemporaneous. We have evidence that. Excuse me a second. Well, we have some evidence that Spinoza knew about the Sabbatean movement. There were actual people in Amsterdam who became followers of Shabbtai Zvi. Spinoza knew of them. And so Gratz has this kind of binary. There's Spinoza, the rationalist, whom Gratz feels a certain sympathy for. Shabbtai Zvi is an irrationalist, negative figure. He does the same thing with Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn he pairs with Israel Baal Shem Tov, and for him, Hasidism is also a very negative, irrationalist movement. So that's Gretz. Of course, later historians who are perhaps less ideological, like Dubnoff and Baron, have a much more measured approach. But I think that it really has to await Scholem, who is able to point out, who really does the spade work in the Sabbatean sources, to really get a fix on both Shabbtai Zvi as a person. I mean, Scholem's biography of Shabbtai Zvi is over 800 pages. It's an amazing work. And Scholem did all the spade work in terms of later Sabbateanism as well. So both Dubnoff and Gretz don't give him as extensive a treatment as Scholem, and they probably did not see him as central as Scholem did. I mean, Scholem really puts him right at the center of Jewish history, whereas other historians, earlier historians in a way, see him as a sort of a passing phenomenon and not that central.
There's a bunch of questions about bringing this topic to the contemporary landscape and the contemporary political landscape. I wonder if maybe you could speak about Jesus and contemporary ideas about messianism, both in the kind of Christian messianic, ideas about this current state of Israel. There's some questions about the kind of relationship between Jewish religious Zionism and this phenomenon as it relates to kind of ideas about Jesus.
So I think what the questioner may be asking has to do with evangelical Christianity, which sees the reestablishment of the state of Israel as a kind of a step in a process of the second coming of Jesus. And that's, of course, led to a kind of Christian Zionism, if you want. Of course, what underlies this theology is the idea that 144,000 Jews will convert to Christianity, and the rest are going to disappear in the end times and the Armageddon of the end times. I think that the writers that I spoke of, and many that I did not speak of, and there are a lot of writers like Pinchas Lapid, Geza Vermej, people who want to restore. These are historians who want to restore Jesus to his original Jewish setting. That's a very different kind of approach than the evangelical Christians, who will, of course, acknowledge that Jesus was originally Jewish, but that he goes on to found what is the fulfillment of Judaism. And that the Jews, even though they are the prophets of this original Judaism, of this sort of fulfilled Judaism, the Jews may have a role to play in the messianic drama, but it's a kind of an ancillary role and one that is ultimately, I would argue, rather negative. So I would distinguish here between the scholarly kind of approach, restoring Jesus to his original context, and this more sort of apocalyptic Christian approach, which has a very different trajectory.
Do you think then that there's a connection between the kind of the potentially messianic way of thinking about religious Zionism with this Christian Zionism, though?
Yes, there are very strong connections between them, and in fact, there are, we even know that there's a certain amount of funding that comes to the settlement movement from these evangelical Christians, especially, for example, the archaeological dig that's going on next to the old city of Jerusalem that's supposed to reestablish the city of David. As a Christian messianists are very interested in all of this and support it. And they also support the settlement movement because they see it as a fulfillment of Israel's, so to say, biblical mission to reestablish the Jewish state as a necessary preparation for the final apocalyptic redemption that Christians envision.
Fascinating. There are a few questions about, speaking of other writers' approach or thoughts on this, about Amos Oz and both the novel The Heretic and also the novel Judas. And I wonder if you're familiar with these works and if you have any thoughts about how they relate to this topic today.
So I assume that when you say The Heretic, you're referring to his last book was How to Speak to a Fanatic, I think it's called.
Perhaps.
I think that's what it is, and I have not read that, so I can't comment on that. The book in Judas actually really is not particularly about Judas. To me, it was a little bit disappointing because I thought he was going to actually recreate. I mean, it really has to do with a scholar who's studying that. It's more focused on that figure. But I would say, from what I know of the Oz book that I have not read, but also from what I know about his general political position, is that he, like Scholem, was extremely worried about the dangers of a kind of fanatical messianism for the state of Israel. And I think that Scholem already pointed out in the 1920s, and maybe even Herzl himself intuited when he thought about Shabbtai Zvi, the dangers of Zionism becoming messianic. And that's why his treatment of Shabbtai Zvi in that Alt Neuland, it's rather brief, and it's a complicated passage, but I think that he's very worried about Zionism getting dragged in that direction. Scholem in the 1920s also extremely worried about that. And Oz, writing much closer to our own time, I think was equally worried about the dangers of a kind of messianic nationalism, which can would be a kind of absolutist, that is, would see a kind of absolute ideology as its goal, rather than one that would be the result of compromise or negotiation.
Speaking of other texts, another viewer asks about the depiction of Sabbatinism in Sutton and Garai, and if you have any comments about that.
For sure. Well, Bashevis Singer there is interested in the way Sabbatinism plays out in a shtetl. So it's a kind of much later version. It's not really about Shabbtai Zvi himself. It's a later version of that. And yeah, I think that what Bashevis Singer was, I think, really attracted to the idea of the demonic. We know this from many of his writings, and so the idea of Shabbtai Zvi or Sabbatianism as demonic force is what's at work. And by the way, Scholem also saw Sabbatianism as kind of demonic. In that sense, there's a kind of a similarity between them.
We have a ton more interesting questions, but I'm going to limit it to just two more. One is about Chabad and other kind of contemporary messianic movements, and if you have anything to say about the connection with this topic.
Yeah. So one of the things that I didn't mention that is a similarity between Christianity and Sabbatianism is in both cases the Messiah fails, right? In the case of Christianity, he's executed, right? In the case of Sabbatianism, he's confronted with a choice between execution and becoming a Muslim. And he takes what I would regard as a more reasonable course out, and he converts, but he also he fails. In other words, his mission fails. And then the interesting thing is what happens to the movement after the Messiah fails. And in both cases, the failure of the Messiah is then reconfigured into something positive. So Jesus has died to release us from our sins. His death becomes an essential part of the theology of Christianity. In the case of the more radical Sabbateans, they would say, some of them would say, well, Shabbtai Zvi had to descend into the realm of evil. That is, he had to become a Muslim in order to redeem his soul, which had been trapped in the lowest worlds. Just like in that story I began with, of Shabbtai Zvi in hell. The more radical Sabbateans said, well, we need to imitate him. Just as he converted, we too will convert. So the so-called Donma sect in the Ottoman Empire, they convert to Islam, and they carry on a kind of crypto Sabbatean Jewish rituals that are outwardly Muslim, but inwardly, they have these hymns that are dedicated to Shabbtai Zvi. And the Frankist movement in Poland, they convert to Catholicism. So this is something that they have in common. Now, with respect to Chabad, so Chabad, the Messianism in Chabad goes back to at least the fifth Rebbe, Shalom Dov Ber. The sixth Rebbe also cultivates a certain messianic doctrine. And of course, this comes really to the fore in the last years of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Rebbe. He never actually overtly declares himself the Messiah, but his followers believe, or at least some of them believed in during his lifetime that he was the Messiah. And then after his death, and here too, the Messiah, if he was the Messiah, he's failed because he's died. And so the movement has in many ways followed the same course. Some people become disillusioned. They say, well, he obviously wasn't the Messiah. He was a great teacher, perhaps. We can continue following his teachings, but he wasn't the Messiah. And then the more radical followers say, well, no, he was the Messiah, and he is, as they say in Shia Islam, he's an occultation. He never actually died. He's hiding out somewhere, and he will return at the appropriate moment. And so the same dynamic can be seen there as in Sabbateanism and Christianity. And there's a great scholar of Orthodox Judaism who has polemicized against Chabad and argued that David Berger argued that Chabad is actually no different from Sabbateanism, which in his view is no different than Christianity. So Chabad is a kind of a Jewish Christianity, if you accept that argument.
That's a fascinating argument. So perhaps a good question to end on is, you've showed how these figures have been a kind of prism through which, different beliefs and ideas have been refracted throughout time. And, do you have any kind of concluding thoughts on what they could mean to us, or what they might mean for us today in a secular Jewish context?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think that I'm going to speak for myself alone. My feeling is, and here I'm going to echo Scholem, who famously said, nothing Jewish is alien to me. So Jesus is not alien to me. He is a product of a Jewish context. Shabbtai Zvi is not alien to me. No heretic is alien to me. All heretics are part of our story. And, in a sense, in the modern world, we are all heretics, because the word heresy originally in the Greek means to choose. We all choose. Even Orthodox Jews make a conscious choice because they have an alternative. They could be secular. So we are all heretics in a certain sense. And therefore, all of these heretical movements in Judaism belong to us. And maybe I will close with a bit of self-promotion. I've just published a book called Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, in which I've written about some of these issues that we've spoken about today.
That's wonderful. We'll all have to rush to the bookstore to get that book. And David, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to Yivo.